In the 19th century, reports began to emerge across West Africa of animal attacks, but on closer inspection, colonial authorities began to suspect that this was the work not of animals but of humans. The victims all shared similar marks like heavy bruising on the back of the neck, meaning that people were first bashed on the back of the head, then very neat mutilations. One arm would be removed, the skull and vertebrae would all have been stripped of flesh, and the heart and lungs would also have been removed. Witness reports then testified to an incredibly elusive secret society known as the Leopard Men. They would dress like leopards along with claws and then ritually cannibalize their victims. At first glance this might seem like something colonizers would make up to shock the people back home. After all, these Leopard Men would appear in Tarzan and even in Tintin books, alongside some pretty terrible caricatures of Africans. But this group really did exist, or at least the people did. Their society seems to have crossed borders from at least the Congo right the way through Nigeria and onto Sierra Leone. Now how far communication travelled is up for debate, but the beliefs and actions were all the same. Men would dress like leopards, attack and then eat people. In fact, there were also similar groups in the region, like the Alligator Society, which I'm sure you can guess what they do. But first, if this world of intrigue and the like sparks your curiosity, well then I can confidently say that you will love CuriosityStream. Think of it like the Netflix for nerds, as they host a huge collection of award-winning and exclusive documentaries. So let's say you want more conflicts between civilizations and ideas, well then there's First Contact, Lost Tribe of the Amazon. This documents Amazonian tribesmen as they leave the jungles and the fights that have begun to take place. Or for a little more history, there's the China Mission, which looks at Irish missionaries working in Asia during the troubled 20th century. Otherwise, there's a whole host of other categories you could delve into, like science, nature, society, or join me in a little true crime. There's thousands of movies and TV shows on there for you, including 35 collections of curated programs handpicked by their experts. So use the promo code JABSY to sign up, and you get access to this whole library for just $14.99. This is for the whole year, and thousands of titles will be at your fingertips. And I do mean at your fingertips, as you can stream to any device, anytime, anywhere. So you can watch some amazing titles on your way to work every day for, again, just $14.99. That's just the price of a couple of coffees. But to get a whole year at this price, again use the promo code JABSY and follow the link below. I'm sure you will enjoy this Hulu for history buffs, that is CuriosityStream. So, in 1877 the attacks began in Gabon around Libreville. 30 people were killed in just 2 years and panic swept through the city. This panic was so bad that people refused to go out into the countryside, and the 3,000 people inside the city began to suffer from the lack of food. Slave owners blamed their slaves, many claimed these murderers had the ability to actually turn into animals, and French missionaries blamed the traditional beliefs of the locals. So the colonial authorities were at a loss on what to do. But women were often the victims, and many of them were just children. After them came slaves as the next largest group of victims, despite them often being accused of the murders. These two groups of victims actually provide a bit of insight into the tensions boiling up in colonial Africa. For starters, in Gabon at least, the arrival of the Europeans brought about a huge change in gender roles among the Mpongwe people. For instance, most glaringly, many French began to arrive in the region and used their authority to get whatever they fancied essentially. And there are many reports of Frenchmen being seen walking around villages naked in the daylight, moving from hut to hut. Yet for some women the arrival of the Europeans proved to be beneficial. They got an education at missionary schools and moved into the city, free from the expectations of village life. There's also cases like Marie Unda. She was an educated woman who worked as a sex worker long enough to begin to purchase her own slaves, and generally she gave up on the idea of marriage. So in this climate, the chiefs and freemen of the hinterland were struggling to find many wives, and in the past, many wives had been a great way to display power. And yes, slavery did exist still, even though we're now into the 1870s. The French founded Libreville for emancipated slaves, but they really just turned a blind eye to the ongoing slave trade within the colony. And these slaves often bore the brunt of the superstitious beliefs of their masters. They'd often be accused of killing their masters by supernatural means, and many would be executed for this. And they could really be accused of anything, like turning into elephants in trampling fields, or eating livestock in the form of a leopard. But most commonly, they would be accused of visiting a witch doctor and killing their masters through some force or spirit. However, prior to the 1870s, the French just sort of let this happen. Like in 1867, one French admiral went out to meet a condemned slave. He was currently being eaten by ants, and he had to confess through an interpreter who had actually accused him of the crime. But the admiral just accepted this as truth. But in the 1870s, the French began to challenge these executions and sometimes even helped protect the accused. Of course, this is a complicated issue, but within this environment, you can see why slaves and women were the chief targets of the Leopard Society. It seems here at least that this was almost a fight back against the changing of hierarchies and traditional norms. And on the supernatural, it should be said that missionaries, both African and European, often reported on quite a lot of body parts found within Mpongwe villages they visited, including baby's blood. Trying to explain this belief is a little bit tricky, but the people almost believed that by sacrificing and consuming body parts, this would give you some sort of energy. So it's very similar to Vodun in Sierra Leone. Now you probably know Vodun better by its name across the Atlantic of Voodoo. But it originated in West Africa, and still today if you visit a Vodun market, you can find an assortment of animal parts, all allegedly with the power to give you something or other. Well, human body parts could also be found in some places, and still very recently. If you look at the recent civil wars in Liberia, for instance, General Butt Naked openly admitted to consuming babies before battle, and this idea of consuming humans to give yourself power can be found across the world. The Maori, for instance, would do this in New Zealand, and one of the more unique I've found is the Itoro people of Papua New Guinea. They believe that a youth must ingest the semen of an older male in order to properly mature and grow. So the Leopard Society in West Africa, especially around Sierra Leone, Liberia and Ivory Coast, can be seen as a forerunner to the likes of General Butt Naked, as they would allegedly drink the blood and eat the flesh of their victims in a mix called porphyma, which would give them the necessary power to shapeshift and continue hunting. The belief in potions to at least bring people closer to animals still actually exists in West Africa, like with the hyena men of Nigeria. However, within this part of Africa, there's actually a whole host of secret societies, each with their own unique identities, like the Ekpa people in Nigeria, who could apparently speak to their ancestors. Then there's also the Poro and their female equivalent, the Sande. The men would go and listen to a man dressed in full fetish dress, give speeches and occasionally place taboos on things, while the women would attend masquerades and, unfortunately, perform female genital mutilation. These groups, by the way, still actually exist. In colonial times, one British official named Claude MacDonald commented that the Ekpa practiced a sort of superstitious fetish worship kept by the kings, chiefs and freeborn of Old Calabar, by means of which they keep the lower classes in subjugation. This group was actually described as a big threat to the colonial authorities. There is no force in the country that works more powerfully against the government, and in my opinion, they ought to be suppressed without mercy. This belief that these groups were meant to subjugate the poor and the slaves sort of alludes more to the Aro people's old beliefs, in which they believed in an oracle called Ibini Ukpabi. They would of course perform ritual duties, but also would settle legal disputes, murder cases and the likes. The trials would take place in Arochukwu in a cave complex, and inside the caves there were a number of quite ominous sounding shrines and tunnels, like the Shrine of Nakedness, where the guilty would be stripped, and the Tunnels of Disappearance, which got its names because whoever lost the trial was sometimes killed or personally sold as a slave by the Ibini Ukpabi. So secret societies and religion often kept the slave trade ongoing right up until the 20th century. But going back to the Leopard Society, to suggest that they were anti-colonial may be a bit of a stretch, which I'll get onto in a bit, but they continue to pop up again and again. In Sierra Leone, the British made a report called Human Leopards, an account of the trials of human leopards before the Special Commission Court. This report was published in 1915 after a growing number of attacks. But again, were these attacks related to those in Gabon? Was there any communication between the different countries? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but it seems unlikely, and really, the idea spread more than direct contact. But on this report, which you can find online, documents many cases and tries to tackle the causes. Cannibalism is probably only a byproduct in these murders. Originally, it may have been to bind the murderers together and so preserve secrecy, or it may have been to continue leopard acting. Gradually, however, the notion arose that human flesh had specific virtues, as the Bophima's energy was replenished with human fat. So the attacks happened in Gabon in the 1870s, Sierra Leone in the 1910s, and the last cases that I'll focus on is in Nigeria in the 1940s. For a long time there was a growing number of Christians in the country who adopted the new religion with a great deal of militancy. They founded groups like the Christ Army Church, who acted pretty much the same as the more traditional societies. This adds a certain additional problem to those who wanted to keep to the status quo, along with new taxes and subsequent riots in the interwar years. Well, in the 40s the attack began, and again, to make matters more complicated, there were actually man-eating leopards in the region at that time. So some colonial authorities refused to believe the rumours of a supernatural group of leopard men. But it's estimated around 157 people were killed between 1942 and 45, all of whom shared very similar marks. But many still doubted the leopard man hypothesis. That is until villages were raided and many people were found to have leopard skins, claws and the likes. Some chiefs were actually arrested during these as well, but many witnesses refused to come forward, believing that the leopard men were supernatural. Plus there was also the additional problem that leopard hair had been found on the bodies. However, it was soon found out that this hair had come from a dead leopard, meaning the cannibals were placing the hair on the bodies deliberately. So a curfew was placed in the affected areas and traps were set. In one story it is said that an officer named Terry Wilson sent one of his men onto a path where many had been killed. His team then lay in ambush, and that night a man in leopard robes came charging out brandishing a club. He smashed the officer on the back of the head with a club and then fled into the bush. The trap therefore seemed to have failed, but Wilson told his men to leave the body. He waited alone and in a couple of hours saw a man crawling out on all fours to approach the body and begin to claw at it. Apparently he also snarled as if he was a leopard, but Wilson shot him and proved that these leopards were not supernatural. A wave of people then stepped forward, safe in the knowledge that they wouldn't be attacked by a demon or the likes, and reported people who were in the society. Many of them were arrested and executed in a back prison. However, the subsequent trials revealed a lot about their motives. For starters, no Europeans were attacked, so this wasn't an anti-colonial thing. Again, over half of the victims in Nigeria were women. Some were murdered because of adultery, or just some wife of a local rival. Even a couple cases showed that the woman just rejected their advances. Some leopard men revealed that Chief Ukpong had encouraged his people to carry out attacks in order to acquire body parts. But many cases were just meaningless, some sort of sadistic pursuit or show of bravado. However, with all of this information, the British were able to clamp down on the religion of the local Anang people, which was called Idiong. Then slowly the attacks began to wane. But, as mentioned before, their legacy has popped up in more recent years, like in the civil wars in Liberia, where President Charles Taylor was alleged to have connections to the Poro Society, and his men were ordered to cannibalize victims. So that is just one of the stranger secret societies out there. Do you know any stranger ones? Leave them in the comments below.